My name is Andrea Chen, and I'm 34 years old. I used to believe that love meant compromise, that relationships required bending until you forgot what your original shape looked like. Then one Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text that would crack open everything I thought I knew about the man I was supposed to marry. "I'm taking the ring back. You don't deserve it." I stared at those words for what felt like an eternity, sitting in my office at the architecture firm where I'd spent the last 9 years building a career from late nights and coffee-stained blueprints. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. Instead, something cold and clear settled over me like morning frost. I typed back 3 words that would change everything: keep it. Then I blocked his number, closed my laptop, and for the first time in 3 years, I smiled without having to convince myself it was real. But let me back up, because every ending needs context, and this one started long before that text message arrived 3 years ago. I met James Mitchell at a gallery opening in downtown Seattle. I wasn't even supposed to be there. My friend Sophia had dragged me along after a particularly brutal work week, insisting I needed to do something that didn't involve structural calculations or zoning codes. The gallery was one of those minimalist spaces where white walls made everyone's voice echo like we were all more important than we actually were. James stood in front of an abstract painting, head tilted, wearing a charcoal sweater that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. When he turned and caught me staring, his smile was warm, easy, the kind that makes you forget you were just planning to grab some free wine and leave. We talked for 2 hours. He told me he worked in finance, managing investment portfolios for high-net-worth clients. He made it sound thrilling, like he was moving mountains of money with a flick of his wrist. I told him about my work, how I specialized in sustainable residential design, trying to build homes that didn't just sit on the land but worked with it. He seemed genuinely interested, asking questions that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years. By the end of the night, he'd asked for my number, and I'd given it without hesitation. The first 6 months felt like something out of a romantic movie. James was attentive, thoughtful, the kind of man who remembered small details. He'd text me good morning before I even woke up, send flowers to my office with notes that made my coworkers sigh with envy. He took me to restaurants I couldn't pronounce, introduced me to wine I pretended to understand, and made me feel like I was part of something bigger than my quiet, structured life. When he proposed on a weekend trip to Vancouver, overlooking the harbor at sunset with a ring that caught the light like a promise, I said yes without thinking twice. I thought I'd found my person, my partner, the one who would build a future with me brick by careful brick. What I didn't realize then was that James wasn't building anything. He was performing. And I was about to discover just how expensive that performance had been. I should have seen the signs earlier, but love has a way of blurring the edges of reality until everything looks softer than it actually is. James moved into my loft apartment in Capitol Hill about 8 months after we started dating. It made sense at the time. His lease was ending, we were spending every night together anyway, and he talked about how much he loved the exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. What he didn't talk about was rent, utilities, or any of the practical details that come with sharing a space. When I brought it up once, casually mentioning we should figure out how to split expenses, he kissed my forehead and said we were partners now, that keeping score was for roommates, not for people building a life together. I let it go. I told myself he was right, that love meant generosity, that his contributions would come in other ways. Those other ways never materialized. Instead, James had a talent for making his presence feel like a gift I should be grateful to receive. He'd cook dinner occasionally, elaborate meals that required expensive ingredients I'd find charged to my credit card later. He'd plan weekend getaways to Portland or the San Juan Islands, romantic escapes that somehow always ended with me covering the hotel, the restaurants, the activities, while he promised to get the next one. The next one never came. His excuse was always the same: a temporary cash flow issue, a client payment delayed, an investment that hadn't matured yet. He worked in finance, after all. Surely he understood money better than I did. Surely this was normal. The engagement ring should have been my first real warning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. When he proposed, I was so caught up in the moment that I didn't think about the cost. It was beautiful, a 2-carat diamond set in platinum, the kind of ring that catches light from across a room. But 2 weeks later, when I casually mentioned it to Sophia over lunch, she asked how much it cost. I realized I had no idea. That night, I found the receipt in James's email, left open on his laptop while he was in the shower. He'd put it on my credit card. The one I'd given him for emergencies, for groceries, for the small shared expenses I thought we'd agreed on. $12,000. I stared at that number, my stomach twisting into something cold and hard. When he came out, hair still damp, smiling like everything was perfect, I asked him about it. He didn't even flinch. He said he'd wanted to propose with something worthy of me, that he'd been planning to pay me back once his bonus came through, that I was ruining a beautiful moment by making it about money. I apologized. I actually apologized for bringing it up, for making him feel small, for not understanding that grand gestures required sacrifice. He held me that night and whispered that we were in this together, that my success was his success, that marriage meant sharing everything. I believed him because I wanted to. Because walking away would have meant admitting I'd been wrong about him, about us, about the future I'd already started building in my head. The months that followed were a slow erosion of boundaries I didn't even realize I'd set. James started working from home more often, which really meant scrolling through his phone on my couch while I left for the office at 7 in the morning. He'd talk about deals he was closing, clients he was meeting, opportunities that were always just around the corner, but his bank account never seemed to reflect any of it. Meanwhile, my credit card statements grew thicker, my savings account thinner, and my explanations to myself more elaborate. I told myself he was going through a rough patch, that finance was unpredictable, that supporting your partner meant more than just emotional availability. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was a Saturday night in late spring, one of those perfect Seattle evenings where the sun stays out until 9 and the air smells like salt and possibility. James had invited his college friends over, 3 guys I'd met a handful of times, the kind of men who talked loudly about investments and laughed at jokes I didn't find funny. I'd spent the afternoon preparing, cooking a meal I knew they'd like, setting the table with the good dishes, playing the role of gracious host because that's what James expected. Everything was going fine until Marcus, the loudest of the group, made a comment about the engagement. He raised his glass and grinned at James, saying something about how lucky he was to lock down a woman with her own place and a steady paycheck. The table laughed. I forced a smile. But then Marcus continued, saying James had really figured out the secret, finding someone who could bankroll his lifestyle while he figured out his next move. The laughter got louder. I looked at James, waiting for him to defend me, to correct the implication, to do anything that resembled respect. Instead, he shrugged, smiled that easy smile I'd fallen in love with, and said something that made my blood stop moving. He said I was a good investment, that he'd always had an eye for value, that marrying me was probably the smartest financial decision he'd ever make. The table erupted. They thought it was hilarious. I sat there, fork frozen halfway to my mouth, realizing that I wasn't his partner. I was his portfolio. I excused myself from the table, saying I needed to check on dessert. Nobody noticed. They were too busy laughing, swapping stories about their own relationship strategies, treating love like it was another market to manipulate. I stood in the kitchen, hands gripping the counter, staring at my reflection in the darkened window above the sink. The woman looking back at me seemed smaller than I remembered, worn down in ways I hadn't noticed happening. I could hear James in the other room, his voice carrying that performative confidence he used when he wanted to impress people. He was telling them about our wedding plans, about the venue we'd toured last month, the one I'd paid the deposit for, while he nodded approvingly like he was doing me a favor by showing up. Something inside me shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden burst of anger or tears. It was quieter than that, more like a door closing softly but permanently. I walked back to the table, served dessert with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, and played the part for another hour until his friends finally left. James kissed my cheek as they walked out, told me I was amazing, that dinner was perfect, that his friends were so impressed. I nodded, started clearing plates, moving through the motions while my mind worked through calculations that had nothing to do with architecture. That night, after James fell asleep, I sat at my desk with my laptop open and started going through everything. Bank statements, credit card bills, receipts, every financial document I could find. The numbers told a story I'd been refusing to read. In the 2.5 years since James moved in, I'd spent over $80,000 on our life together. His half of rent that never materialized, utilities he never offered to pay, groceries that somehow always ended up on my card, the engagement ring, the vacation he'd insisted we needed to Cabo, the new suits he claimed were essential for client meetings, the watch he'd bought himself for our anniversary using my credit card because his was temporarily maxed out. $80,000. I sat there in the dark, the only light coming from my screen, and felt something cold settle into my chest. Not rage, not sadness, just clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself. Monday morning, I went to work like normal. I sat through meetings, reviewed plans for a new eco-friendly development in Ballard, responded to emails, functioned like everything was fine. But during my lunch break, I made a series of phone calls. First to my bank, requesting new credit cards, canceling the supplementary card I'd given James. Then to my landlord, asking about the lease terms, confirming that only my name was on the contract. Then to a lawyer, a consultation about protecting assets before marriage, about what happened to joint expenses when only one person was actually paying. The lawyer's voice was professional but kind when she said I wasn't the first person to call with this exact situation. She asked if I wanted to proceed with documentation. I said yes. That week, I moved like I was underwater, slow and deliberate. James didn't notice anything different. He was too focused on a new business opportunity he'd found, something involving cryptocurrency that he needed to invest in quickly. He asked if I could loan him $15,000 to get started, promised he'd double it within months, that this was finally the break he'd been waiting for. I looked at him across the breakfast bar, at the man I'd agreed to marry, and felt nothing but distance. I told him I'd think about it. He seemed satisfied with that answer, kissed my forehead, went back to his laptop. I watched him, really watched him, and saw clearly for the first time what I'd been funding all along. Not a partnership, not a shared future, just his comfort at my expense. By Friday, I'd opened a new bank account and quietly transferred most of my savings. I'd made copies of every document, every receipt, every text message where he'd promised to pay me back and never did. I'd packed 3 boxes of my most important belongings and stored them at Sophia's place, telling her only that I might need some space soon. She didn't ask questions, just hugged me hard and said her guest room was always available. That night, James came home excited, talking about reservations he'd made at that new steakhouse downtown, the expensive one with the month-long wait list. He said we were celebrating, that we deserved a nice night out. I asked what we were celebrating. He said us, our future, everything we were building together. I smiled and asked if he was paying. He laughed, said I was funny, that he'd obviously get the next one. I told him I wasn't going. He looked confused, then annoyed, asking what was wrong with me lately, why I was being so difficult. I didn't answer. I just went to the bedroom, closed the door, and started drafting the message that would end everything. The words came easier than I expected, probably because they were finally true. The text came on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after that dinner with his friends. I was in the middle of a client presentation, explaining the solar panel placement for a new build in Fremont, when my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced down and saw James's name. The preview showed enough for me to understand. I excused myself, stepped into the hallway, and read the full message. I'm taking the ring back. You don't deserve it. You've become selfish and cold. I can't marry someone who doesn't support my dreams. I need a partner who believes in me, not someone who keeps score like we're strangers. I read it twice, standing in that empty hallway with fluorescent lights humming above me. 3 years of my life, $80,000, countless compromises, and this was how it ended. A text message blaming me for not giving enough. I thought about all the ways I could respond, all the things I wanted to say about dreams that cost money he never had, about partnership requiring two people, about how supporting someone doesn't mean funding their entire existence while they criticize you for noticing. Instead, I typed 3 words. Keep it. Then I blocked his number. I walked back into the conference room, apologized for the interruption, and finished my presentation. My hands were steady. My voice didn't crack. If anyone noticed something had shifted, they were kind enough not to mention it. After the meeting, I sat in my car for 10 minutes, staring at the dashboard, waiting for tears or anger or something that felt like heartbreak. Nothing came. Just relief, quiet and unexpected, like finally setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for too long. I drove home knowing James would still be there. He worked from home, which meant he'd be on my couch, probably streaming something while scrolling through his phone, existing in the space I paid for like it was his birthright. I'd already decided what needed to happen next. I'd made the calls during my lunch break, set everything in motion before he could even finish typing his dramatic exit message. When I walked through the door, he looked up, surprised. I could see he'd expected me to chase him, to beg him to reconsider, to prove I was worthy of keeping the ring I'd technically bought myself. He stood up, crossing his arms, that practiced expression of disappointment on his face. So that's it? You're not even going to fight for us? I set my bag down, took off my coat, and looked at him with the kind of calm that comes after a decision has already been made. There's nothing to fight for, James. You ended it. I'm just agreeing with you. He seemed thrown by that, like I'd skipped a page in the script he'd written in his head. I thought you'd at least want to talk about this. I thought I meant more to you than a 3-word text. I almost laughed. You mean more to me than an entire paragraph blaming me for not bankrolling your life indefinitely? That's generous. His face shifted, confusion turning to irritation. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You've changed, Andrea. You're bitter. You're keeping track of every dollar like I'm some kind of burden. I nodded slowly. You're right. I have been keeping track. That's actually why I called the credit card company this morning. All the cards you've been using? They're canceled. The supplementary cards, the emergency card, all of them. Effective immediately. The color drained from his face. You can't do that. We have expenses. I have things I need to handle. I shrugged. Then handle them with your own money. You work in finance, remember? Surely you have resources. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to that tone he used when he was trying to manipulate me back into compliance. Baby, come on. You're upset. I get it. I shouldn't have sent that text. I was frustrated. Let's just talk about this like adults. I didn't move. We are talking like adults. You said you wanted the ring back, so keep it. You said I don't support your dreams, so now you can support them yourself. The lease is in my name, James. You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since I'd known him, he had nothing to say. The confident smile disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. You're seriously kicking me out? Over a text message? I walked past him to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and turned back to face him. No. I'm asking you to leave because I finally realized what you've known all along. This was never a partnership. It was a transaction. And I'm done paying. He tried everything after that. Apologies that sounded rehearsed, promises that felt empty, even tears that didn't quite reach his eyes. He told me I was making a mistake, that I'd regret losing him, that no one else would put up with my controlling nature. I listened to it all with the same quiet calm, and when he finally ran out of words, I simply said, 30 days. He left the next morning with 2 suitcases and the ring I'd bought myself. I changed the locks that afternoon. The apartment felt different immediately, lighter somehow, like I'd opened windows I didn't know were closed. I took down the photos of us, packed away the expensive kitchen gadgets he'd insisted we needed, reclaimed every corner he'd occupied. Sophia came over that weekend with wine and takeout, and we sat on the floor surrounded by the pieces of my old life, laughing about things that hadn't been funny a week ago. 3 months later, I heard through mutual friends that James was engaged again. Some woman he'd met at a networking event, someone with family money and a trust fund. I felt nothing when I heard the news, no jealousy or vindication, just a distant hope that she had better lawyers than I did. As for me, I'm still here in my loft with the exposed brick and the floor-to-ceiling windows. I'm still designing sustainable homes, still building things that last. The only difference is now I build them for myself, on my own terms, with my own money. And that ring he took back? I never think about it. Because the most valuable thing I got out of that relationship wasn't something I wore on my finger. It was learning that sometimes the bravest thing you can say is just 2 words, keep it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.